Welcome back. You're still watching S8 Today. Now, the National Youth Development Agency, NYDA, has met with the Pan-African Youth Union, South African Youth Council, and the African Diaspora Youth Forum. The objective of the meetings was to find ways in which youth can respond to the ongoing violence and protests against foreign nationals in Gauteng and other parts of the country. Well, to tell us a little bit more about the meetings, we have in studio the NYDA Chairman, Sifiso Mtsweni, and Ahmed of the Pan-African Youth Union. Thanks very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Let me just start with you, Mr. Mtsweni. I suppose it makes sense that a continent that's the youngest on the planet, it's the young people that are most affected by the things that are happening, that you would meet and talk about these issues.
Well, thank you for having us, Peter. Indeed, you would know that the NYDA itself is a signatory to various international bodies. One of the bodies being the Pan-African Youth Union, the World Federation of Democratic Youth, and so on. So generally, of course, whatever that happens in the country, the rest of the continent would obviously be concerned and would actually ask in terms of what is happening. And some of the manner in which these things have been reported, particularly to the continent, has been quite concerning. But as you say, I mean, if you look around, the people who, are affected, people who are dying, people who are actually, faced with the wrath of this whole thing is actually young people. And everybody else has been talking. We've not really come and actually say what is it that young people are saying about these things. And that's precisely why we thought, let's have this session, let's invite our brothers from the PYU, because they represent the entire continent in terms of the sentiments of the youth, but the South African Youth Council as well as the African Diaspora Forum. I think they've been on the ground quite regularly. They seem to be on the pulse in terms of what are some of the issues, but let's have a frank discussion about this thing, because sometimes we tend to be reactive. Things happen, we react. I think as a country we're in a permanent state of firefighting. We thought, now let's sit down, zoom into the real issues of why are these things actually happening, and what is it that we need to do as young people to ensure that in future such things don't happen again.
All right, so Mr. Benning, tell us what's come out of the discussions so far. What's come to light, particularly from a youth perspective?
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having us. I think that the discussion zeroed down on the actions that we need to take as state parties to curb this. Remember that for us as the Pan-African Youth Union, once issues arise and has to do with citizens of Africa, it becomes an issue of immediate concern to us, especially when you have incidents of Africans attacking themselves. It becomes very problematic. So one of the issues that we agreed on was to address that upheaval between the two sides as a first step. Second was to cooperate among the diaspora forum in South Africa, because remember, if you're supposed to address issues of crime or address issues of social cohesion within the South African space, you would need the leadership of the various country groups, say the Nigerian group in South Africa, Ghanaian group, and these all culminate into what we call the Diaspora Forum. So that exchange of views and opinions on how to address the immediate challenges that led to this. Because when you hear the narrative, the accusation is counter. One side says these guys are dealing in drugs, they are involved in crime. The other side says, no, these guys just don't like us. So for us, first thing we need to recognize is that we are Africans, and as Africans, we are brothers. We just happen to be divided by colonial boundaries, and so we need to sit as a big family to discuss, to put the issues on the table, to say, what are the root causes of these attacks? And then we address them. And I think that we agreed in the meeting that fundamentally the South African state needed to step in to protect life and property of both citizen or migrant. Because once they are within the sovereign jurisdiction of South Africa, the state has a responsibility to protect that. The second issue that we collectively agreed was that there were incidents of xenophobic attacks in South Africa. That by itself didn't imply that the entirety of the South African people were xenophobic. It meant that there were criminal elements within the South African society that just took advantage of a situation to mete out violence. So we agreed that the state and security agencies would then have to address the issue of criminality holistically, whether from migrants or from South African citizens. They need to address the issue using the rule of law and not just allow civilians to take spontaneous or abrupt action against other citizens of Africa. And I think that was an honest and candid step forward.
Mr. Mtsweni, you started by saying, we often forget to look at the root causes of some of these issues. Have you been able to figure out what those root causes are?
Well, as my brother says, we needed to be frank as a start, because indeed the advent of 1994 in our country brought a new wave of hope, a new wave of South Africans actually seeing their lives improving for the better, a promise of jobs, a promise of a better life, a promise of better schools, housing, water, infrastructure. But over some time, of course, those things have happened, but not at a pace in which one would have hoped. So a lot of people still find themselves in the margins, particularly of the economic space. And from time to time, and this is what we've always explained to our brothers, is that South Africa is from a culture of protest, a culture of violent protest. Apartheid forced us into a position of violence. So from time to time, we've seen, for instance, I've made an example about Vuane in Limpopo, where people said we want to move into this municipality, but bend down 27 schools and almost the entire community. In some cases where the service delivery protest, people will actually say, no, we're looking for a clinic here, but bend down everything else in the process. Now, what we needed to do is to now identify all those things. South Africans are faced with a serious socio-economic challenge, which includes unemployment, poverty, inequalities, that we need to address on the one side. But on the other side, there is a real perception that exists, by the way, that some of the foreign nationals that are here do not respect the laws of our country. When you talk about the dealing of drugs in the CBDs, we've seen the raids of counterfeit goods. We've seen that even in the raids, we found dangerous guns. So those things are there. But I think one of the things that we've then said is that we shouldn't say that because there are one or two Nigerians that are actually dealing in drugs, it means the drug problem, it's a Nigerian problem. In Cape Town, we've deployed the army. It is there. It is South Africans that are actually dealing in those particular drugs. When you talk about crime in our country, we think that everyone that is within the borders of South Africa must respect the laws of this country. And I think one thing that we've put very clear in this meeting is to say that also the PYU, it needs to call out the leadership of this continent. Because why are we having refugees in any country for that matter? In the continent, we shouldn't be having refugees. We should be having proper governance in our countries. Why is it that we can sit with presidents for 40 years, 46 years in office? We sit with dictators. We sit with people that displace people. We sit with ethnic violence. We sit with religious violence. All those things become a spillover that unfortunately comes into South Africa, that in itself faces a lot of socio-economic challenges. So when we find collective solutions, it's not about South Africa alone. But I think another third point that I need to raise is that we also identify that within our system, there's a lot of gaps. People come through the borders, undocumented, they enter into the country. How do they do that? It means there are elements of corruption that I actually found. When they were doing the raid in the CBD, police got arrested for actually selling back that counterfeit. So we also have a very serious problem of corruption. We have a very serious problem of inefficiency in some Home Affairs centers. You go to Marabastad every day, there's a long queue of people who say, actually document us. We are here. And I think holistically, let's address those things. But quite importantly, Africa needs to start uniting, and we need to start getting our house in order in the continent as a whole.
All right, Africa uniting, and this is, I suppose, in many ways, why you have Pan-African bodies such as yours. And I've always looked at this story, we fly this AU flag and we rah, 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 but when we move away from these meetings, we go back into our own little shells and communities. are we making positive strides towards an African identity, which is, I belong to Africa, I'm an African, meaning that I'm from anywhere on the continent? Or is that still quite a way away?
I think fundamentally we've made substantial progress as a continent in terms of rallying around one common purpose. And if you look at even from the African Union point of view, there's been an introduction of special purpose vehicles to propel this continent onto the path of rapid growth and development. And that couldn't happen without building consensus among governments and among citizens of Africa. However, I think the biggest challenge has been the trickle-down effect. How do we make the ordinary African citizen understand the relevance and importance of integration? I think that has been the fundamental challenge that we've been confronted with.
Right.
Our
We're running
government.
out of time, but I really wanted to get a learning from the ECOWAS story, where you have this community of West African states, free movement between. If we set that up around the country, the continent, we do have these bodies, but the movement isn't there. Would this solve, or go a long way to solving some of these inter-nation tensions?
I think yes. One of the biggest challenges that we have as a continent is the movement of goods, services, and people. And that's been at the center of the rift that countries have had over time. If you take the ECOWAS story, as you rightly put it, we move freely, even though we have some bureaucratic hindrances in terms of movement of goods because of the different customs regimes in the respective countries. However, we believe that if we break down the borders, and then, like he said, the governance systems are working, and we have countries where leaders don't overstay in office, and then they are committed to social good. Then at the end of the day, we would have a system where we have an egalitarian system where welfare is distributed across board. And so you wouldn't have people seeking asylum in other countries and then tensions brewing because they need to get documentations and not getting documentations and so on and so forth. So for us, breaking down the borders is a significant step for us. Remember that as a continent, we just signed on to CFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is very important in this discussion. Because South Africa is the foremost economy on the continent, and you are just plus minus 50 million. This continent is expected to grow to 1 billion.
Yeah.
And if you are 50 million, the shock absorber for the South African market then would be the African, the 950 million out there. So if we have incidents of violence and then it develops or culminates into some sentiments against South Africa, I don't think that the numerous assembling plants and manufacturing industries that you have is able to absorb.
As we always do, but I hope that we can have this conversation again and see just how we're making strides. After all, our future is in your hands as the young people of the continent. Gentlemen, thanks very much indeed for coming through.